The information found in this podcast is not a substitute for help from a licensed mental health professional. Hi, and welcome to the Women in Depth podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Lourdes Viado. Join me as we explore the inner lives of women, their struggles, fears, hopes, and dreams. We'll go beneath the surface and take a deeper look at what is hidden, unknown, uncertain, and uncomfortable. Hi, and welcome back. Today, my guest is Dr. Allison Quadhamer. Allison is here today to share her insights on a type of relationship that many of us find ourselves in, or we see, friends, loved ones in these types of relationships. And, the relationship that she's going to talk to us about is the toxic friendship. There's a lot of attention on toxic intimate relationships or toxic familial relationships, but not a whole lot of conversation about friendships that are toxic and unhealthy. But before we go into our interview, I wanted to start by telling you a little bit about Allison. Through Allison's life experiences and her learning experiences, she has come to understand that our perceptions of the world affect our physical, mental, spiritual health, and relationships. Allison states that her own distorted perceptions, which were formed during a dysfunctional and emotionally abusive childhood, were keeping her from the life she wanted. Using the principles of neuroscience, Allison changed the way she perceived the world, and by doing this, created a fine life that she loves with her husband and 3 adopted sons. Allison has taken what she has learned and has helped thousands of people transform their perceptions so they too are able to create their own version of a healthy, happy, fine life. Allison has a master's degree in communication, which is the basis of healthy relationships, a doctorate in chiropractic, which is the basis for healthy bodies, and advanced degrees in neurology, the basis of a healthy mind. Hi, Allison, and welcome.
Hi, Lourdes. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. I am really excited about our topic today because it's one that there's just not a lot of conversation about, but it's very, very common. So thank you for being here.
Well, thank you again for having me. And yeah, toxic friendships are not something of the mainstream. Toxic family relationships are taboo, but they're still talked about. And a lot of people know what the dynamics of a toxic family are. Toxic relationships, obviously intimate relationships, are obviously a hot topic with the terms narcissist being flown around and codependency. But not a lot of people tend to take a lot of time to look at the other relationships in our lives and how they play into the grand picture.
Yeah, whenever there is conversation about friendships, they're usually talking about Mean Girls, and they're talking about when you're in junior high and high school. I think that's right.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, there's some very obvious toxic, quote unquote, friendships, and Mean Girls is a great one of them. But the toxic friendships can be much more subtle than what we think of as the typical Mean Girl scenario.
Okay, so before we get to that, because that sounds really juicy and I'm so excited. I almost went with you right then. Okay.
Sorry.
Okay. One of the things that has struck me with your work was your use of the phrase fine life. And I noticed this the first time, I think it was your website, or maybe it was your Facebook business page. And then I also, of course, I when I was preparing for our interview and you shared this in your bio. So I wanted to ask you, why is the phrase a fine life meaningful for you? Because you put it everywhere.
I really do. It's important to me for a couple of reasons. Number one, ultimately, what I and most people strive for is simply to be fine. And my own personal history, I had a lot of early life fame and accolades, and really early on realized that that is not where purpose and meaning is found. It's through recognition and accolades. And ultimately, all I wanted to do was to be able to look at my life and go, yeah, I'm okay. This is fine. Right?
Right.
Which, when you think about it, like people are like, you just want fine, you don't want happy, you don't exuberant. Like all of that plays into it, but ultimately the underpinning is to have that sense of stability or certainty that I can handle whatever comes my way, which ultimately means it's fine.
Yeah.
And kind of how I look at the world is if things are not fine, they're not over. If you haven't made your peace with it, if you haven't understood that you can handle this, that you can get through this, then it's not fine yet, which means it's not over and there's still work to do.
So fine can mean, I want to make sure I'm understanding you right.
Yeah.
Fine means you still have power, energy, ability to influence or impact your situation.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And a lot of people look like, I want to make this huge impact in the world. And my aim is not to make a huge impact, even though that may happen. Right? That's not the ultimate goal, right? Because the ripple effect, I have no control over the ripple effect. I want to know that I have control over, that I know that I am presenting it as best as I possibly can and handling as I possibly can, which to me equals it's fine.
So really it is that you are taking all the steps that you can take to create the life that you want.
Exactly.
I like that.
And there's also a little inside joke with my husband about the fine life. Very first Christmas, he's like, we need our own tradition. And I was like, okay, well, what should it be? And he took my hand and we stood in front of the Christmas tree and he goes, we've created a very fine life.
Aww,
yes, we have, my dear. And we do that every Christmas.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
And I don't know if this is similar, but this popped up when you were talking. When you talk about a fine life, is this similar to, for example, like with Winnicott, who was an English psychologist, and he talked about the good enough mother, that it's not that you have to be super mom. It's not that you're a terrible mom because you weren't able to or willing to, whatever, XYZ.
Right.
But there is such thing as the good enough mother, and most children just need a good enough mother. I mean,
yes,
I don't know.
Exactly. Because if you think about someone who you view as supermom, who has done everything for her children, is volunteers for everything, schedules her life out to the T. She's exhausted. She has no sense of self. She lives her purpose through her children, which isn't fair to her or her kids. Because once the kids are grown, ideally, they should individuate and separate from their mom. But if that can't happen, then you have that codependency created in their adult relationship as well, where the mom then becomes dependent on the child and the child feels that they need to serve their mother. And the cycle repeats. So that the good enough, right, is an example of a mom who owns what she can and cannot do, owns her strengths, knows her weaknesses, and looks at her kid and goes, this is how I come to the table, kid. I'm going to do my best what I've got, right?
Right. I love that.
And ultimately, from background with your child or with anyone really, you can create a relationship, both recognizing your strengths and your weaknesses and creating a harmonious relationship as opposed to a toxic or a codependent relationship where you're looking to the other person to fulfill your needs.
It seems like with a fine life or the good enough mother, it's really the realistic or the real human relationship with both parties doing their best.
Exactly. And it's the recognition that the best is not perfect.
I like that.
Yeah.
Because I think we get caught up in that with weddings, marriages, children.
Oh, we get it caught up with it in Pinterest. I look at some of the things that my son's friends bring for snacks, and this butterfly goldfish with glued on eyes and a paperclip, and I'm like, here's a 24-pack of Cheez-Its.
I love it. So, Allison, the reason, I had originally scheduled this interview was because I was reading something probably on Facebook. And what popped out was a blog post you had written. And I know it was a two-parter, so I'm not even sure if it was the first or a second.
Yeah.
I saw that you had written about toxic friendships. And when I saw that, I instantly realized that this is a big deal and no one talks about it. Like,
yes.
People experience this all the time.
Yes.
And to me, that was really interesting that here's something that's kind of right out there. People are living this, seeing and experiencing it. And there's no conversation. That was like, honestly, the first time I had seen something or read something
really
acknowledge the existence of this experience, in many of our lives. And so I knew that this was a topic that would be relevant to everyone. And it's something, again, that is hidden. It doesn't have to be overt. And it affects not just women, but men also. So I wanted to ask you, why did you write these articles?
Honestly, based off personal experience. Because we really can only speak from what we know, right?
Absolutely.
And I had noticed a pattern in my life that had come to completion. And it was this cycle of primarily female friendships that became really intimate really quickly and then very explosively blew up in my face. And I was left feeling like, what just happened? Like, I thought we were friends. and those are some of the more dramatic, but then there is other friendships too. And this is something that is prevalent in the recovery literature, actually, because they talk about the people that you hang out with and how they affect your behavior and that you need to change who you're hanging out with as you recover from addiction. But what most of us who are not addicted to substances, we can become addicted to the drama or the chaos, especially if we were brought up in that kind of an environment and we didn't have role models to show us what healthy interaction looked like. And so we find ourselves repeating these patterns of having like a revolving door of friends, right? And it's the same scenario, different faces, as we go through our life, with very few people who hang on for the long haul.
So then, if you were going to describe what's a toxic friendship, what qualities could it potentially contain? And maybe if you could talk about qualities that are external, that can be seen, witnessed, heard, and then perhaps the inner factors that come into play.
One quality, and this is not my phrase, I totally stole it from someone else. Her name is Rebecca, is the concept of co-signing negative behavior. And it's sort of this license to be self-destructive or act against your best interest for the sake of camaraderie. And so these would be the people who are like, we're going to have an enemy and we're going to go TP her house or crash in her windows. I'm giving very dramatic examples right now. Or we're going to continue to gossip about all of these people behind their backs. And never do they ever turn to you and say, there might be another way to handle that.
Right.
Maybe you don't respond, right? Maybe just let it wash off your back and walk away, right?
Right.
Instead of inciting drama and chaos or encouraging you to perpetuate unhealthy coping mechanisms and behaviors that you've developed.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's one characteristic. Another would be the perpetual gossiping and just negative talk all the time. That is what your relationship is based off of. Basically, you've bonded over putting other people down. And there's really no positive element to the relationship. Also, you're going to look at an imbalance of, I don't know if power is the right word, but it might be, where one person essentially just goes along with the other one and never has a say. And if they do try to speak up, they're shot down pretty quickly. And they're like, nope, this is what we're doing.
Is that similar to like this imbalance? Would that also describe a friendship where one person is just treated really badly by the other, but that person who's being mistreated just continues to be there.
Yes. It's an imbalance, like I said, an imbalance of power, an imbalance of respect, an imbalance of autonomy. One person essentially subjugating themselves to another, and the other one lording it over. And I don't want to come up with stereotypical examples.
No, this is great.
But yeah, you're also going to look at things where time, space, and boundaries are not respected. So it would be like the calling at 3 a.m. just to call, even though you know the other one's sleeping or out on a date or whatever kind of deal, and then letting that happen. You could also potentially look at friendships that supersede the other primary relationship for the people.
Okay. Can you describe what that could look like, an example?
It would look like, let's say in a straight couple, the wife essentially never having date night, but going out with the girls all the time.
Okay, got it.
And no one ever saying, you should probably go hang with your husband. That also is dependent upon the husband-wife relationship, but at the same time, ideally what should be the primary relationship is put into a secondary place.
So what I'm hearing in what you're describing too, Allison, is that in these toxic friendships, it's a two-way dynamic.
Absolutely.
It can't happen with just one person expressing the unhealthy behaviors. There needs to be like someone to hit the ball back.
Yes. All relationships are two-sided. There has to be someone doing something and someone else allowing them to do it. Whether they're aware that they're allowing them or whether they feel like a victim of this other person is entirely a separate issue, but they still have to be part of that dynamic for this friendships to occur.
There's like an unconscious agreement to respond in a certain way.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. It could be unconscious, or it could be a consciousness of, I don't want to upset them, or I don't want to cause drama, so I will just go along with it. For the sake of having the relationship outside of the quality of the relationship.
Yeah, it's fascinating because, when I think about when I've seen this dynamic happen with clients or family or friends, there's a sense that for the person who feels that maybe they're the ones being subjugated or they're the ones who are giving all the time, that this other person is doing this to them. Or they talk about the friendship and they complain about it. However, there's never any action scenes or in changing things.
Right. This is a common dynamic, not just in friendships, but also in romantic relationships and family dynamics, where there are a lot of toxic elements, and the person who feels victimized or feels subjugated also claims to feel powerless in the dynamic, and that they just have to go along with what is being done, or they have to accept that they are the victim. And the reality is that's not true. You always have the choice to speak up or walk away. It's just the consequences of those choices are not always desirable, because in that dynamic, when we are the party who feels as though we're the victim, a lot of times we're in the relationship for the sake of the relationship. And it wouldn't matter who was on the other end of that relationship. It's just as long as someone is there.
Wow. You just need someone to do this dance with.
Exactly. Because there's an underlying fear of being alone, or there is a significant lack of self-worth and the fear that they won't be able to do it on their own, or that they're like kind of making friends with the devil that you know.
Yeah.
So it's sort of like, well, I know what's going to happen here, so I'll stick this out, instead of building the reserve to take this, to have the courage to take the steps to try to create change, either within the relationship or moving on from the relationship.
Yeah, that's so powerful, because you can see how unless either individual makes the deep inner changes, the shifts in perception, which we're going to talk about soon or next, that's why they stay. And that's why if they do leave, they just repeat the pattern.
Exactly. And those patterns are really plug and play. Each party, unless they start to become aware of what they're doing, will just continue to repeat the pattern with different faces.
Yeah, I've said this to clients and others that if you don't do the inner work with this, if you don't change, it's going to be the same situation, just another person.
Mm-hmm. This isn't anything new I'm talking about.
Right.
People long ago and much smarter than me have talked about this.
But, it's always interesting to me, though, that so many will feel that if I end this relationship and find the right person, then I'll have the relationship that I dream of. But really, if you are still the same person doing the same things in the next relationship, it's going to be, the same outcome.
Exactly. The right person is you.
Right.
You have to become the right person.
Yeah.
And something else that I haven't talked about, and maybe this will transition into the perceptions part of this, but a lot of times, especially in same-sex friendships, there is an element of, especially if there is a challenging mother-daughter relationship at play, there will be an element of that mother-daughter where one is more mothering and one is more of the daughter role.
Interesting.
As sort of a corrective emotional experience. And this is actually something I counsel people to do who have challenging mother-daughter relationships. However, the other party needs to know that they're coming to them as a mother figure and agree to it.
So it's like it has to be made conscious. Like you can't just be, okay. Yeah. Okay. So one of the things that I would say this is foundational for your work, it's been foundational in your own journey, in your recovery and healing, is the concept of distorted perceptions.
Yes.
So what are they and why do they matter?
Well, our perception is what we think is our reality. Perception is reality. Reality is perception. And it is highly influenced by the environment that we grew up in. It is highly influenced the meal we ate for lunch, how much we slept, whether or not we just exercised, whether or not screaming in the background, right? Because all of those things are going to affect what we can become consciously aware of at the moment. And so I'm sure all of us have had this experience or something akin to it where, so I had this experience where I was working out and I was in that place in the workout where it was like, dear God, I'm going to die, but I only have 5 minutes left. I can do this, right?
Yes, been there.
And of course, my son came in right at that moment and had to tell me something that was like, because he just likes to talk all the time, right? And immediately my perception was, this kid is just being annoying and won't he just shut up and don't judge me, right? But I was in that state because I was so stressed out and my body was reaching its max and I snapped at him because I was like, just stop! I can't think anymore! I can't do anything! Right? And of course, I went back and mediated that and apologized after when my brain was a little bit more coherent and I was able to handle a little bit more stimulus because my body wasn't being pushed to the max. And so our perceptions are wholly subject to the things we have, and we currently are experiencing. And none of it is real. Absolutely none of it is real. Because if you think about it, what we see, right, the physical act of seeing is literally taking light waves, turning them into electrical and chemical signals that our brain interprets and then, brings and makes this picture in front of our face. Right?
And we just go with it that this is reality.
Exactly. But the reality is light waves. Right? And so when you think of it that way, perception is easily mutable and changeable.
And that's so amazing. It's so powerful. Like right here, you have this amazing tool to begin to shift your experience immediately. It's like changing a lens.
Yes, exactly. And the work I do specifically, I work with patients and I figure out how do they primarily perceive the world they live in. Because most of us will either rely heavily on our visual component, it's about 70% of the population at large, and then about 10 to 15% will rely on what they hear primarily, and then the rest will rely primarily on what they feel. And you have your odd little ones who rely on what they taste or smell. My youngest son is actually a smeller. But that is how they're neurologically wired to perceive the world. Now, we all have all of those, but we rely more heavily on one than we do the other. And so when it comes to perception, the perceptions that we have in terms of memory is not remembering. It's not like going into a file cabinet and pulling up, October 2nd, 1992. We actually go back and we are reliving. We physiologically are reliving the event as we have stored it in our memory.
It's interesting. We're reliving it as we have stored it. So not as it happened, but as we stored it. Wow.
As we stored it. Because every time you run a memory, it creates new pathways and new wiring in your brain, and you either strengthen or weaken it depending on how many times and how often you remember it. And so every time it changes a little bit. And this is well documented that memory is fallible. Your memory is a lie.
Well, I think that all moms know that. Okay. Right?
And a great example of this is we've all had the experience of going back to our grade school as an adult, right?
Yeah.
And I remember the first time I went back to my grade school as a full-grown adult, walking into the bathrooms. Right? That are made for children, made for children up to the age of 10 or 11. And they're small and they're short and the toilets are close to the thing. But you have that memory of an elementary school kid. And so you walk in and you're completely distorted,
right? Because
you're no longer the size of an elementary school kid. You're a full-grown adult.
That's a great example.
Yeah.
I love that.
So what to you, still as a full-grown adult in your memory felt like a very large, spacious room, in reality, you're looking over the top of the stalls. And so when it comes to perception and knowing that memory is fallible and memory changes on its own, just based on how often you remember it and the state that you're in when you're remembering it, you can actually work with your memory to change your perception. And so what happens when we do this is if you grew up in a highly dramatic and chaotic and emotionally abusive home where you didn't have good role models for relationships and you've created these patterns of very toxic relationships throughout your life, you can go back in those memories where you laid down the meaning of love and abuse go together, right? And you can change it so that when someone starts behaving in a way towards you where you're like, in the past, it would have been like, oh my gosh, they're love bombing me and they're giving me so much attention. They're calling me all the time and they're texting me at all hours and they want to do everything with me all the time. This is awesome. They're the best person ever. Really, where that is the first stage of priming you for a toxic relationship.
Wow, that's so powerful because it really explains how we end up in situations later that on a rational level we can look at and say, this is not healthy for me. Why am I making these choices? And people get, then you start to beat yourself up and shame comes in because why am I doing things that I know as a aware, healthy adult who's trying to grow and learn, why am I making choices that are sabotaging? And now you can see this power that you're not even aware of when these parts of you, I guess, get into the driver's seat of your life and start driving.
Exactly.
Right?
And it's very seductive, especially with friendships. Ultimately, my opinion, and a lot of other smart people's opinion who are smarter than me, our relationships will mimic and reflect the relationship that we had with our primary caregivers, unless and until we become aware of what we're doing. And so many, many years ago, I had a therapist tell me, if you're not aware of what you're doing, you're going to end up marrying the unresolved issues you have with the parent you have the most conflict with. In my first marriage, that was very true. But at the same time, in your friendships, the same sorts of dynamics come into play as they do in the dynamics with toxic parents and or toxic romantic relationships, but in a less dramatic way, because those are your friends, especially if you still have your parents or romantic relationships in your life, are not the primary source that you're looking for love and approval. But the friends in that dynamic, if you're still in this place of repeating cycles, are going to help you victimize yourself. They're going to help you create enemies out of your romantic partners and or your parents. And they're going to manipulate you into repeating the cycle of drama and lack of self-worth and lack of self-love, because there's still an element in them that needs someone who is broken, basically.
It's like they need a hook,
Exactly.
Right? Yeah. And
yes.
They need someone to step into this scene or of this play or this movie and to enact this part of your life.
Yes.
And it's like, this is your script. This is my script. Let's go.
Yes. And an interesting side note is when I first started speaking out about my relationship with my parents and how toxic and emotionally abusive it was, I came to learn that a lot of my friends from middle school especially had very similar experiences in their house growing up.
Oh, wow.
And it was something we never talked about. It was kind of known like that Allison's mom's kind of weird and a little crazy, but it was never something that was ever like consciously acknowledged. And yet many of my middle school and high school friends have come forward and be like, I never knew, and I had a very similar experience growing up. And so it was almost as if at the time in our lives and at the ages in our lives where we were less powerful than we are as adults because we were still children, we found each other because we understood each other's experiences, even if we never really talked about it.
Yeah. So when you go back to these memories and, how you said that we actually change the memories when we go back to them. And then when we begin to change the way that we respond, we change that script or we change that scene. What's the neuroscience behind that? Is this where when people talk about neural pathways, is that here?
Essentially, yes. So a technique that you may be familiar with that does this is EMDR. This is what EMDR does. Eye motion desensitization reprogramming. However, being a chiropractor, I work a little differently than EMDR does because I can actually physically impact the nervous system through adjustments. But what happens is we physiologically change the state of the person who's being worked on while they're reliving the memory.
Wow.
And so a memory that in the past caused a panic reaction or a flashback or a sense of dread or depression or anxiety, while they're reliving the memory, we physically adjust them to where they are physiologically calm and breathing deeply and relaxed so that they can remember without becoming stressed out.
They're able to be in that experience in a different state, not that
exactly
aroused adrenaline cortisol state.
Yes, because neuroplasticity cannot happen in the presence of cortisol. And so if someone is perpetually stressed out, they're not going to create those new pathways. They're going to reinforce the old pathways. So you actually need to fire up the parasympathetic system, the chill out system. Sorry, I almost said a bad word.
It's happened on this podcast several times by myself and other guests.
But you need to stimulate the parasympathetic system. and get them in a relaxed state where they're breathing efficiently so that they can relive that without becoming stressed out, because the presence of cortisol will actually shut down neuroplasticity, which is the changing of the neural pathways and the creating of new neural pathways.
And so, for example, like if you're working with someone who has anxiety, that's why before they can really do anything meaningful with the techniques as far as changing their cognitions and all of that, they have to learn the relaxation and the mindfulness.
Yes.
Because that creates like the state so that they can do the work in that space.
Yes. Like in a therapist's office, yes, those techniques are invaluable as a chiropractor, because the technique I use physiologically will put them into a parasympathetic drive where they're breathing better. So we can just go right there.
And I can see when you wrote your bio how you connected these three aspects of health, from the way that we communicate, our relationships, and then our bodies. They're really all playing an essential role.
They're all connected. This was not something I consciously realized until well into my chiropractic career. And I had decided to become a chiropractor while I was doing my master's degree in communications, and was then subject to, well, why are you doing this? You're wasting your time and your money. And I was like, it'll pay off eventually.
Allison, I'm going to have to ask you this, because I think that, you are a doctor of chiropractic, and I feel that there are a lot of misconceptions because people are not informed, and they don't know. They don't understand chiropractic. So even though this isn't part of our main topic, what do you think is important for people to know about chiropractic so that they can view it as a serious part of a health regime?
11 years ago, when I met my husband, he asked me a very similar question. And I kind of joke with him, like, this is why I married him, because I asked him one question and he understood it completely. All I asked him was, what is the one organ in your body that controls everything? You want to take a stab at it, Lourdes? Do you want me to tell you?
The brain?
Your brain, right?
Yeah.
So your brain controls everything in your body, and its extension comes through the spine and out the spine as the spinal nerves, which then innervates everything in the body.
Okay.
So the closest thing we can do to influence the brain is adjust the spine.
Powerful.
Very powerful. It's a lot more than back pain and headaches.
Amazing.
Pain is very little of actually what we do.
Yeah. So if a person was looking to bring chiropractic support into their healing, what do you recommend for researching and making a good choice as far as, a provider, as far as a doctor?
My general recommendation is find someone you trust who is already under chiropractic care and get a recommendation from them. Because if it's working for them, it'll likely work for you too.
That's a really good idea. I like that. Yeah, you don't have to go and read the Yelp reviews.
Yeah, no.
So find someone who's experiencing positive impact of chiropractic and go from there.
Yeah.
Allison, thank you so much for your time today and sharing your experience and your insights and your wisdom. Super helpful. I love how you wove in all these different aspects, from our past, how that comes into the present, from our bodies, from our memory. Just there's so many layers and they all intersect, and you really did a beautiful job of explaining it clearly and simply for our listeners.
Well, I appreciate that, and thank you for having me. This was fun.
What if there are listeners who would like to get in touch with you, learn more about your work, become a client? What's the best way for them to find you?
Yeah, there's the website, www.whatafinelife.com. There's also the Facebook page, What a Fine Life, or you can follow me on both Instagram and Twitter at What a Fine Life.
And thank you so much for the wonderful work that you're doing in the world.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to the Women in Depth podcast. I hope it brings you a deeper understanding of yourself and others, and that you found some insights that illuminated and inspired. You can follow Women in Depth on Facebook and YouTube, and if you haven't yet, please subscribe on iTunes and leave a review. And finally, if you enjoy Women in Depth, please share with a friend. Again, thank you so much for listening, and see you next time.